Thank you very much, Bob, for a fantastic overview of all of these initiatives, which he's involved in all of them, which makes me feel quite tired. Both presentations have opened up some really fascinating discussions, ones that pick up on questions from yesterday. So I think what we'll do is just open it to the floor, take a cluster of questions, comments, and go from there. Yes. Mike. As yesterday, introduce yourselves, even if everybody knows who you are already.
Mike Hume, University of East Anglia. Bob, can I just pick you up on one thing? So absolutely crucial, absolutely essential, lay knowledge. But where in the IPCC, where in IPBES, where on the MEP that has just been elected, where is lay knowledge? It's rhetoric. I don't see any commitment from any of these international assessments to embedding lay knowledge in the process of knowledge assessment.
Miles, next. Yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to come back on the issues about language that Lidia raised, because she talked about simplifying complexity, reducing uncertainty, and so forth, and using new communications channels. And one of the things that comes out of that is that it seems to me these days the noise to signal ratio is rising very considerably, and I wonder how we're actually going to address that. And that touches on what Bob was saying about the importance of ownership by all of what he was seeing as good science for supporting policy, because if all that agree about its validity and about the intellectual basis of it and so on, there's going to have to be some commonality of language and communication. And this strikes me as a really colossal challenge at the moment, so I'd be interested to know how they respond to that. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, first of all, many, many thanks. Oh, I should say that I'm Jeff Oldham. I'm with SPRU. I had STEPS connections. But pertinent to my question is that I did serve for 10 years, both on the UN Advisory Committee on Science and Technology for Development, and then as the UK delegate on the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development. And I know how frustrating an experience it can be serving on those committees, because nothing seems to happen at the end of the day. And the only committee, or the only working group that I was involved in, was the gender one. And there we did put in a sort of an engagement committee to follow up on the activities. So that's where I'm coming from. And what, however, I have found in my own studies of these issues is that we run into difficulties because the time horizon of the needs for decisions about policy varies so much, whether it's at a national level or an international level. And different policymakers have identified it as the one-day problem, where we have to have immediate science advice and no time to set up committees. The 1 to 2 year time horizon, when you can set up all of these marvelous committees that you've both been describing. And then, in particular, the 3-week problem. And most people had ideas on how to solve the 1 day and the 2 year, but very few good ideas to serve the 3-week between identification of the problem and implementation. So one thing I'd like you both to address the issue of how can you meet those different needs. And the other thing is, you talk about the new Secretary General's group on science advice. How can that be more effective than the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development? Or is the Commission now going to perhaps die a death? Thank you.
Great. Andy Sterling from STEPS and SPRU, 2 absolutely wonderful talks. I wanted to ask a question that picks up on the real richness of both to a very specific question for Bob, which goes to our general discussions about what Mike's raised about going from talking the talk to walking the walk. The question is this: I'm having trouble, Bob, reconciling the awe-inspiring richness and sophistication of what you described there in common with Lidia, with the rather unqualified challenge that you made of Anne Glover yesterday about hazard-based assessment. So in effect, in your talk here, you've really inspiringly talked about the importance of addressing unknowns, uncertainties of all kinds, that science is necessary but not sufficient, that we need to take account of lay knowledges, we need to include transdisciplinary fashion, all sorts of dissenting perspectives, be careful about consensus, etc., etc. But yesterday, unless I misunderstood it, your challenge to Anne Glover was that sovereign countries in Europe who decide in certain circumstances to implement regulation by reference to hazard rather than risk are by that token self-evidently irrational. Now, I know you were making a mischievous point maybe, but I'm having trouble reconciling those two things, and it would be helpful, I think, to understand where the limits are of this broad brush approach that you've characterized so well.
We'll have Brian, and then we'll give the panel a little bit of time to response, and I've got a cue for the next round already.
Thanks, Ian. Brian Wynne from Lancaster University. This is really just a proposed amendment qualification of Mike's point about the absence of lay knowledge in the IPBES forming practices and plans and so on. I'd like to propose that one actually supersede, let's say, the notion of lay knowledge in these kind of processes and problems, and actually pose it instead as relevant knowledge. Because there's loads of scientific knowledge in these domains which is irrelevant to the particular problems that IPBES and indeed national and regional local practitioners are facing. And there's loads of relevant lay knowledge, but lay knowledge is such an abstraction that, of course, it's never going to be walked the walk. It's always going to end up just being talked. So relevant, of course, raises all kinds of questions. What's relevant for what, etc. But the point is, it opens the door on actually looking for knowledge in different places. And the arguments about relevance can be accounted, justified, referenced, etc. And I think it also allows for something approaching what Deepak Gowali was actually referring to last night in his talk about multiple 10% solutions rather than actually mega big, completely fantastic kinds of solutions to these issues.
Okay, thank you for those. We'll let Lidia and Bob respond to those before
I pick it up. Yeah.
Before we go to another round.
Now, the challenge on lay knowledge is a very, very valid one. IPCC doesn't even try and do it. They've never made any pretension about it. They don't even try. And in fact, I think the structure of IPCC needs to change at the certain level. Working Group 1 that looks effectively at the climate system, I think is perfectly fine. They can look at that from a global level. They can do downscale modelling to look at the impacts regionally. On the Working Group 2, which is impact and adaptation, I think they need to restructure it so it takes a regional, sub-regional perspective. And that's where you'd want to bring in some of the much more local lay knowledge about what's actually happening on the ground. And in Working Group 3, I think you could split it into two. There's some generic issues that are global, the state of technology, etc. But when you actually ask us the question, what's the barriers to the diffusion of technologies into a marketplace, then again, you've got to understand the local situation. We made an attempt in both the agriculture assessment and the Millennium Ecosystem assessment to bring in more local lay knowledge, and I would say to some level of success, but obviously nowhere near what we need to. So I think one of the challenges, and you're absolutely right to point this out, we made very certain that on the multidisciplinary expert panel, we have one true expert on indigenous and local knowledge. It's a Maori from New Zealand who's actually immersed in the culture of the Maori culture, who's also been trained at a major university, so has done a lot of thinking about how you bring different knowledge systems together. It is like, and we've had 3 workshops on the issue of how to bring in lay and indigenous knowledge, and it is not unlikely we'll have a subcommittee thinking through some of these issues. So you've posed exactly the right challenge, and it's very, very sensitive. I mean, on the plenary, Bolivia, Chile, Venezuela, etc., Australia, New Zealand, even the US have really been stressing that we've got to find a mechanism to bring this into the system. And Brian's comment is lay versus relevant. Yes, obviously, I don't mean that sarcastically, it must be relevant lay knowledge. One of the big challenges on indigenous knowledge is intellectual property rights. Do they want to share their knowledge or not? That is indeed their power. And in fact, in Chile, most indigenous tribes do not recognize the government. Who are you? What's your right to even talk to us? So there's a lot of political issues to sort of think through how to do this. So I think what Mike and Brian, you're both absolutely right. We talk about it. I think time's going to tell whether we can do this successfully or not. And as I pointed out in my talk, if we can work with local communities on their knowledge base, then the question is, how do you actually got validity and quality control on it, basically? So I think that is indeed a particular issue. The time horizon issue that Jeff brought up, I don't really see a major problem with that. I mean, you know, the policymaker does need, information today, or in 3 weeks' time, or 1 to 2 years' time. This is why I think science, multidisciplinary science advisory panels is crucial. So if I was asked when I was either in the White House or the World Bank or in DEFRA to give an answer, if I didn't know the answer, I'd simply say, I don't know the answer. I'll get back to you in 24 hours or within 6 hours, but I knew who to phone. And I wouldn't phone one person because everyone's got biases. So I would phone various members of the Science Advisory Council or various people I knew through networks in the national or international community. So the role of a science advisor is to know, where is that knowledge base? What's the spectrum of views on a particular issue? So when you go to a minister, you can indeed talk about what's known, what's unknown, what's the evidence behind them. So I didn't find a problem there. The 1 to 2 year one is why we can do assessments, although actually it's 1 to 5 years. So I think you need science advisory committees and advisors that actually understand the network and have a broad view of the science. So I found that to be the most interesting and challenging part of being an advisor, basically. Andy's point, my point to Anne yesterday was the system in Europe and the system most places is broken. And actually it's broken in the policy process because of vested interests. In a paper that Camilla and I and some other Blue Planet laureates wrote, one of the big issues was governance. And fundamentally, policy making has been captured by vested interests. Some it's vested interests of governments, some it's vested interests, especially in America, of the private sector. And so yes, the public's very, very important, but in US policy making, it's not the public that's most important, it's the lobbyists that lobby Congress, and that is the ultimate power base in the US, a bit different in Europe. My comment on a hazards-based approach is everything's hazardous, just about. Water's hazardous. Electricity's hazardous. Every chemical is likely to be hazardous. But what you have to look at is the risk-benefit of using that. Can you reduce the hazard to a manageable level that you can get the benefits out of a chemical or the benefits out of electricity? So when you go to a pure hazard-based approach, it will stop all technological evolution. And so you come down to the question, the hazard-based approach to me is the ultimate in the precautionary principle. If in doubt, ban it, basically. And I have some real nervousness about that. Now, the longer a chemical is persistent in the environment, or the more hazardous it is, I can see that we have to think through the hazards-based approach versus risk-benefit in a more precautionary manner. But by just talking about pesticides like triazoles or some of the polymers they want to ban from babies' bottles, I think it's just the wrong way to go. So I really do believe the risk-benefit analysis, carefully done, is much better than simply say, the chemical is hazardous, let's ban it, basically. But it is the ultimate in a precautionary approach that I just don't actually believe in.
Okay, let's move to Lidia for a quick set of comments.
Well, let me start with IPCC and this concept of incorporating local knowledge. At UNESCO, and in fact in my division, we have a section that works with indigenous knowledge systems. And what we did for IPCC, and we launched the book in Rio+20, was really to produce a set of good information, scientifically sound information about knowledge systems or knowledge-based approaches in local communities. And when I say knowledge, I'm not saying scientific knowledge, but the studies that collect and systematize these experiences were taken in a scientific way and really provide to the panel this literature. So maybe there is hope that in IPCC, the next one will bring some of these solutions, and particularly, as you said, on the adaptation and mitigation component. And I do hope that you do the same, because it's not just about involving the stakeholders in a blind way, but really guarantee that you have access to valid and credible sources, so that this knowledge can indeed permeate the assessments. In relation to the language issue and linked to ownership, again, I of course, changing and finding a common language, it's not an easy process, an easy task, but it's about the process. And that's why I proposed that evidence-based policy advice is not about giving advice in 1 day, in 3 weeks, in 1 and 2 years. It's much more than that. It's how to permeate the processes of decision making that allows for that language to be constructed. And I think, and we have seen that science is already changing. Future Earth is a very good example that the scientific community is changing the way it governs itself, the way it frames the programs. Can we also use this experience to change decision-making processes in other communities, be it governments, be it private sector, be it even civil society? So I think this is that part that I think we have to go beyond responding to demand, you know, in the end of the process, to creating demand during the whole process. And there, it's for me, when you can anticipate, and therefore not to be nervous when you have 2 weeks to give quite complicated and complex advice. Because if you are part of the decision-making process, you should be able to anticipate what kinds of needs are coming, and therefore being a little bit more prepared. And of course, as you respond, this kind of multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary teams will be, of course, much easier to respond. I will stop there.
Brilliant. Okay, I've got a queue of people, starting here in the front, then going to Robert, then to Jimmy, then to Melissa, and then anyone else who wants to put up their hand.
Hi, I'm Ruth Siegel. I'm a doctoral student at SPRU. I was interested, sort of picking up on the discussion yesterday about consensus. I was interested in Bob's comment, first of all, that within the IASTD process there was sort of massive disagreement on some key issues, and actually, you know, the final report has disclaimers from certain countries in it. But at the same time, the process that you're talking about, you talked about in depth about how you're developing it. You were talking about building consensus and not having any voting. I just sort of wanted a bit more information about how you balance those two experiences.
Robert Chambers, IDS. There's been a theme running through it's been mentioned by practically every speaker we've had so far, and it hasn't been picked up on. And I want to ask the panelists their views on this and what they think might be done about it. And it's capacity building. I mean, we throw these words out very, very easily, but does it need a lot of serious thought about what capacities, and much more than capacities, are needed to move in the sorts of directions that we're thinking about? Now, there are two aspects of this which haven't been mentioned at all, as far as when I've been awake, at any rate. And the first one is reflexivity. And the reflexivity, and by this I mean self-critical awareness about one's own mindset, motivations, interests, and all the rest of it. Should that should reflexivity be part of every good scientific education so that we have scientists in powerful positions in the future who do know what epistemology means, as we were told some of them might not yesterday. And the second aspect is to do with attitudes and behavior, because attitudes and behavior and how we interact with one another and how scientists interact with one another and with others would seem to be a crucial dimension in the future. So those are my questions to you. There was a glimmer from Alice Bell yesterday. She mentioned that at Imperial they do something a little bit on these lines, and it would be really good to know more about that and about other initiatives.
Thank you. Jimmy Whitworth from the Wellcome Trust. I was very interested and thought it looked a really nice model within the future Earth governance to have the engagement committee working side by side with the scientific committee. But with any committee, you've got individuals who you are wanting to represent certain stakeholder groups. How do you actually go about with a engagement group like that, where you've got stakeholder groups that might not be that organised, might not be that cohesive? How do you identify individuals who are appropriate and have the legitimacy to represent that stakeholder group?
Thank you. Quick, Melissa Leach from the STEPS Centre. First of all, a quick comment on the lay knowledge, relevant knowledge point. I think we need to be really careful here that we're not boxing lay knowledge together with some kind of politicised notion of Indigenous identity, represented perhaps by key individuals from prominent cultural groups. I think what we need to be talking about is the array of toad's eye views, as Deepak put it yesterday. People living with environments, with ecologies, farmers, herders, water managers, people in peri-urban settings, whose knowledges are deeply enwrapped with ways of life, livelihoods, ways of managing resources. And we need to be attentive to the questions that they're posing, which may not be the same as those that scientists and global decision makers are posing, and try to generate some more bottom-up dialogues as part of these processes. So I'd be interested in any comments from either of you on the mechanisms to make that happen. But my other question is, if one were able to do that and to take forward these totally laudable sentiments about identifying in future Earth pathways to sustainability, a phrase we use in the STEPS Centre a great deal, it's what we're about, multiple perspectives, transdisciplinary views, multiple cultures and so on, how does one then avoid the pyramidal process that we discussed yesterday, whereby this diversity becomes reduced to a singular consensus, which is then required to deliver singular solutions to a policy process? I'm particularly interested in this challenge with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals process, and would be interested in any reflections on how the world might end up with a set of SDGs which do justice to this diversity that we're all aware of. So any comments there, greatly appreciated.
Hi, Claire McNulty from British Council. It's actually a follow-on from Jimmy's point, because it was specifically about the engagement committee and the scientific committee. So it was asking, will both committees have equal weight, first of all, in what they talk about? But also, will you have any representative from youth networks? Because if you're talking about pathways to sustainability, then they're really the crucial group to engage. And also they are engaging with each other on a global level in different ways, so that there should be new ideas coming out through that.
Okay, David Dixon from SciDevNet. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of ideas that come together and to make a plea really for including science communication and science communicators and science journalists, of which I am one, in this whole process. Because I think when it comes to a question of formulating a common language, journalists are the people who often play a role not merely in conveying knowledge, but also creating the frameworks, creating the possibility of dialogue between the people at the top and the people at the bottom. So that this role that journalists play in framing issues is a critical part, and this means that they need to generate the capacity to understand the issues and put them into terms which are accessible both to the people on the ground, the people who sort of receive what journalists are doing, and the people in the decision-making decision-making process. So, I mean, I know a lot of thinking has gone into this, but I haven't heard very much mentioning it so far, and I'd really like to place it on the agenda.
Okay. Martin Kovacs, Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, Berlin. Brief question to Professor Watson. You suggested that assessments should explore alternatives, present several options, policy options. My question is, how would you select the options you explore in more detail, and how would these options deal with political or ethical conflicts, political standpoints, so not scientific disputes, but political disputes?
Hello, Mike Powell from IKM Emergent Program. I'd like to follow on from Robert's point really about capacity building and the training issues that came up yesterday, and ask, you've come up with loads of lovely words which make me feel so happy to hear. The transdisciplinarity, which of course is quite common but still problematic in many institutions, co-creation, co-design, even better, lovely words. I mean, does anyone know how to do this? I mean, or is this largely aspirational? Because our program's been looking at these issues in the development sector, and the number of constraints on working in this way are massive, including the whole reporting, planning, evaluation and funding is entirely geared against such processes. And the space for investigating and working out how to do it is guerrilla created, I think we would agree. So, you know, if this is going to become mainstream, if this is how science and knowledge needs to work, how is it going to be taught and normalized?
Plenty to chew on there. Who would like to go first? Lidia,
I can start with the capacity building issues, and then a lot of the other ones were addressed to Bob. Really, the capacity building aspects are fundamental, and they are not easy. But I think Robert, you brought something very important. This question of attitudes and behavior, and bringing reflexivity to the capacity as a skill to our scientists. But I would even go further, but also to our leadership, because a lot of our graduates, they don't end up in science, but they end up being our leaders, be them government or in the private sector or even in the NGOs sectors. So to build attitudes and the behaviors and the skills to really start developing reflective leaders, I think is definitely a responsibility of our education system. And in fact, it's quite interesting that we really are not talking, although we are in the university, we are not really talking about the university systems and how well are they anticipating the needs for the future, both in the research component, but also in the leadership that we will need in the future. So clearly there is room for that, and really a committed kind of younger generation of scientists. And when I'm saying that, and yesterday this was mentioned, the importance of giving some skills on public policies. And I'm saying public policies, not just research or STI related policies, in public policies. I think there is a void everywhere in the world of leadership that can really develop good public policies. And part of it is the fault of the way we train people, and that comes back to the issue of transdisciplinarity. We have very traditional curricula, we have very traditional ways of promoting academic excellence, and that has to be changed. And clearly the higher education sector, it's really a community, and the leadership in this community has to be engaged in these debates, and we are not seeing them. You know, Council of Rectors, Association of Universities, they are not really part of this debate. And I was very happy before coming to here. I was in Lisbon because one of our UNESCO Category 2 centers, it's starting a program for postgraduate and graduate students on science policies and capacity to build public policies. And for the first time, I saw, you know, the rector that is leading now the Council of Universities in Portugal, the vice president of the Association of Portuguese-speaking universities. It was the first time that I saw this major group really being part of the debate. What do we need to change the way we train our graduates in order to advance this global sustainability agenda? Having said that, it's so important that we quickly reduce the divide in scientific capacity, that we need to be also very creative. And I think this is one of the issues that both me and Bob mentioned, that whatever process we do in relation to global policy advice, we need to make sure that the capacity building component is embedded in that process. So not only the formal component of how do we design our higher education degrees, our science education curricula at primary, secondary, but also using any opportunity to really improve the capacity, the scientific capacity in different parts of the world. And international collaboration will be fundamental for that. You can't expect a country that has maybe 1,000 PhDs in different areas to really be able to support their countries in policy advice. So the international collaboration, the networks, these kinds of platform, and your proposed website-based platform, I think are some of the solutions that we have to develop. The rest, Bob, I think it's all on your lap.
Yeah, and they can all be brought together at one level or another. One question towards the end was, has anyone really tried co-design? The example I would give is actually the International Agriculture Assessment that I directed. And the first part was, did we need such an international assessment? So we had 10 regional workshops around the world, 8 of them in developing countries, 2 in developed countries. 1,000 people attended them in total, typically 100 each, just to ask the question, did we need an international assessment on agriculture, science and technology for development? And in the end, of course, the answer was yes. We decided to go ahead with it. But in those consultations, it wasn't just scientists. We brought in government representatives, people from industry, and actually farmers on the ground. So when we finally decided the one in Africa, we not only had representatives of the science community, we actually had 100 farmers where we broke them into 10 groups, each with a community leader asking, what are the challenges you and your villages face in Africa on the issue of agriculture and food security, which of course went far beyond, as I've already said, the issue of agricultural production. When we actually then put the assessment together, it's the only time it's really been done, we put a bureau together of 60 people, 60. It was actually quite manageable, surprisingly. 30 government representatives, geographically balanced, 30 members from civil society. There were 6 representing farmers groups around the world, 6 representing consumer groups, 6 representing big agro-business, 6 NGOs, and 6 from different science organizations such as IUCN. So when we put the bureau together, I would argue that was co-designed. What did the governments think were important issues? What did the private sector? What did the consumers think? What did the farmers think, etc.? Now, I would argue that was co-designed, and it was an incredible social experiment. And a couple of people in this room were actually part of that social experiment. Because when we came to the issue of consensus, And the three big thorny issues were genetic modification, pesticides and trade. Consensus didn't mean to say we all had the same view on GMOs, or all had the same view on trade. The consensus is, did we agree on what that chapter said? Did we accurately reflect the range of views and the evidence behind the views on trade, on GMOs, on pesticides? So consensus meant that if we agreed with that chapter fairly represented that range of views and the evidence behind those range of views. Now, it's also true big business walked away, because we were not endorsing blindly GMOs, we were not endorsing blindly pesticides, and therefore they actually left through CropLife International. It had incredible tension in the governance between the NGOs and the big business, basically, because they were very thorny issues with very, very different views. But that was the strength of the Ag assessment. It didn't work perfectly, and in fact no one's willing to put such a governance structure again together for an international assessment. Certainly IPBS were not willing to do that. But I would argue you can do it. Equally, you brought up a key question was, okay, who chooses, who represents the different groups? What's the legitimacy? And it is a real problem. What we actually did is, during the consultation of these 1,000 people, we actually did ask the NGO community who would represent. In the end, we went with the large international NGOs. We went with people like Conservation International, Oxfam, Greenpeace. They actually don't have full legitimacy, as we heard from the talk from Nepal yesterday, with many of the local NGOs. So when we did the regional assessments in Asia, in sub-Saharan, because we did actually a global assessment and 5 regional assessments, we had some very local NGOs, especially from the Philippines, that were very, very active. So we tried at each level of the overall bureau, and then almost what I call the individuals at the regional level, to try and really bring in the full range of voice, from business to even local activists, basically. But it makes it a very demanding process. But it's the only process that works. You need all relevant stakeholders. But who chooses the legitimacy of who represented business, who represented the NGOs? In reality, you want self-selection. That is a long, difficult process. And so we short-shrifted it by actually making certain choices through the regional consultations. Less than perfect. Will youth be on the engagement committee? I don't know. I'm going to Paris in about 2 weeks' time to think through how would you put an engagement committee together. There are 9 major groupings under the UN system, and youth is one of those, science is one of those. So we need to think through whether we use those nine major groups or not. I mean, we need to think, what's the relevancy, basically? So there are some real issues here, and I'm not trying to belittle them. So I think we're trying to go in the right direction. Whether we got it completely correct, I don't know. And obviously this is a learning process, basically. I won't touch capacity building, basically. So I've talked about the self-selection. So, for example, who would I pick? And say I pick. Why should I have any voice in this? Who would I pick from business? Well, the first one I would put on the engagement committee, to be honest, for Future Earth, is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They represent 60 to 70 of the major multinationals around. They're committed to sustainability. Unilever and other companies such as Unilever truly are trying to embed science, that is social science, economics, and that into their processes. So that's a personal view that they would be a good representative. Who would I get from the NGO community? Interesting choice, basically, or from youth, basically. Let's see. There was a comment about, lay local knowledge, the toad's eye view. Absolutely. This is why I believe IPBS, now going to the assessment process, we will start with regional, sub-regional, and potentially even national assessments, making sure that the questions are well posed for those sub-regions, and hopefully they will be done at a scale where some of those toad-eye views can be brought together with the eagle-eye view that we heard yesterday from the speaker from Nepal. The whole issue of science communication. In the Future Earth document, you'll see in probably about 2 to 3 months' time, I think you'll see an interesting science strategy and a science framework. I think you'll see a fairly good document on institutional and governance structures. But you also see two other documents. One says towards a communication strategy. I got it yesterday to review. And the other one says towards capacity building and education. We have not nailed those. We put far more effort into the research strategy and into the institutional framework than the communications. But in the Secretariat, it's already recognised, both in IPBS and in Future Earth, we've got to have some real communications experts and engagement experts. And I like the word engagement because that's a two-way process, thinking through the so-called hurricane model of communication engagement that C4 and others actually use. So that's one model we've been playing around with. So I would say we need advice and help on both the capacity building and education and on the community. But we recognise engagement is central to the whole thing. And then I think the last one was, yeah, how do we, when you put options forward, you ignore, in my opinion, the classical political debate, but you know you're playing into it. So it's the evidence. What is, if you want to go to a low carbon economy, what's the range of technologies that could get you there? What's the range of policies that can get you? What's the range of financial incentives that can get you there? What types of behavior change would need to be stimulated to go to a low carbon economy in production and use of energy, etc. So one will actually analyse is what is the state of technologies, what's the state of economic tools, how does the market work, and from that you can actually put the options and the ensemble forward of if you want to achieve this, these are the types of options. It's up to the political process whether or not to take them into account. Yes, we should look at ethical issues, no question whatsoever, but again they vary from one country to another, so we should expose those debates quite clearly. But I personally don't see a major problem of giving an ensemble of options much easier given a single solution, which then does play into political barriers, ethical barriers, etc. I think I've roughly covered long-term versus short-term. I think the big assessments and the research programs we're talking about will actually play into both short-term decision-making and long-term decision-making. So, for example, the National Ecosystem Assessment for the UK ended up with a white paper on the natural environment, which is a philosophy and a policy that will last for decades. The IPCC has helped to stimulate national thinking and international thinking on climate change. So what's it done in the UK? It's led to the Climate Change Committee and the Climate Change Bill that argues that by 2050 the UK must reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. So I do believe these assessments and these research programs play to the needs both short and very long term in both climate and biodiversity. But they are a challenge. You need what you need then is a politician or politicians and a government process that can afford and is willing to take a long-term view. That's where I would say in climate change, in nearly every country of the world, the issue of climate change is a political football that if you've got one party and it goes in one direction, you put another party in another. The exceptions to that are the UK, Germany and France. They've had the same, at the large scale, the same policies on climate change for the last 20 years, whereas Australia does this, Canada does this, and the US, well, you know where the US is, it also does this, basically. And so business doesn't care about regulation. In fact, they often embrace regulation. What they want is a level playing field, and they want some certainty in policy. And that's what the knowledge base is meant to provide, is how do you design policy that it isn't going to change as a political football, that it's resilient to political change at some level, so you can actually give the signal to the marketplace of how to make those transitions.
Lidia wanted to say one last thing.
Just on this one, because one of and for instance in my country, one experience that we had was that we have this 20-year vision, and where it frames really the important aspects of development for the country. And then you have the governments that come and go through this 20-year framework. And because it's linked to a parliamentarian decision, it becomes a law. So the governments of the day, they are framed by a much longer policy in development. And we were very fortunate to have science as part of this long-term vision, and therefore the science policy framework and programs really continue independently who is in government. And I think this is also strategies that we could promote in many countries to really have these longer-term commitments that are, of course, open, more flexible, but they do give these long-term directions that you need. And it's fundamental also for capacity building activities and science education and so on. It's not a one-time deal. It's really a long-term goal, and you need these longer-term visions that go beyond the government. But that's, again, is society, and how to bring that up. And by a much longer policy in development, and we were very fortunate to have science as part of this long-term vision, and therefore the science policy framework and programs really continue independently who is in government. And I think this is also strategies that we could promote in many countries to really have these longer-term commitments that are, of course, open, more flexible, but they do give these long-term directions that you need. And it's fundamental also for capacity building activities and science education and so on. It's not a one-time deal. It's really a long-term goal, and you need these longer-term visions that go beyond the government. But that's, again, is society, and how to bring that up.